Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that on February the 2nd, 2026, the cultural heart of America stopped beating not due to budget cuts or natural disaster, but as the result of a calculated political strategy to weaponize the nation's most prestigious cultural institution against its own artistic community? The announcement came through a social media post that Kennedy Center staff discovered alongside the general public. No advance notice to employees, no consultation with the board of trustees, no coordination with ongoing productions. President Trump simply declared that the Kennedy Center would close for 2 years for renovations, effective immediately. Within hours, security personnel began turning away patrons while artists received termination notices delivered by email. But this closure represents far more than administrative mismanagement. The Kennedy Center shutdown is the culmination of a months-long campaign to transform America's premier cultural institution into a monument to Trumpian ideology, beginning with the December 2025 decision to add Trump's name to the building itself. The facility, originally designated as the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, as a living memorial to the assassinated president, now bears signage reading, the Donald J. Trump Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. The symbolic violence of this renaming cannot be overstated. Kennedy, who championed the arts as essential to American democracy, represents everything Trump's cultural agenda seeks to destroy: intellectualism, international cooperation, and the belief that government has a responsibility to nurture artistic expression. By claiming ownership over Kennedy's legacy, Trump has transformed a memorial to democratic idealism into a shrine to authoritarian personality. The response from the artistic community was immediate and devastating. Major orchestras, dance companies, and theater groups began canceling Kennedy Center engagements in December 2025, launching what has become the largest cultural boycott in American history. The Vienna Philharmonic, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Bolshoi Ballet, and dozens of other internationally renowned institutions declared they would not perform at a venue bearing Trump's name. American artists followed suit, with major figures from Lin-Manuel Miranda to Yo-Yo Ma announcing they would refuse all Kennedy Center invitations until the renaming was reversed. This boycott effectively hollowed out the Kennedy Center's programming months before the official closure. By January 2026, the facility was hosting mostly local amateur productions and Trump campaign events, a dramatic fall from its status as one of the world's most prestigious venues. The closure announcement merely formalized what the artistic community had already accomplished through coordinated resistance. The timing of the closure reveals the calculated nature of Trump's cultural warfare strategy. February marks Black History Month, traditionally one of the Kennedy Center's most important programming periods. The center has historically hosted major exhibitions, concerts, and educational events celebrating African American artistic achievements. The 2026 programming included premieres of works by contemporary Black composers, a retrospective of the Harlem Renaissance, and collaborative performances with historically Black colleges and universities. All of these events have been canceled. Not postponed, not rescheduled, but eliminated entirely. When asked about the Black History Month programming, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated that the events did not align with the administration as vision for American cultural celebration. This language represents a fundamental redefinition of what American culture includes and excludes. The Kennedy Center's closure eliminates the institution's extensive educational programming, which serves over 300,000 students annually through school visits, artist residencies, and teacher training programs. These initiatives, developed over decades, have introduced millions of young Americans to classical music, theater, dance, and visual arts. The sudden termination represents not just cultural loss, but educational catastrophe, particularly for low-income students whose schools lack resources for arts education. International implications extend far beyond American cultural life. The Kennedy Center serves as America's primary venue for cultural diplomacy, hosting visiting artists and orchestras as part of broader diplomatic initiatives. These exchanges, seemingly apolitical, actually represent crucial soft power operations that build goodwill and understanding between nations. When the Beijing Opera performs at the Kennedy Center, these events create human connections that transcend political tensions. Trump's destruction of this infrastructure represents strategic self-sabotage on a massive scale. At a moment when America faces intense competition from China and Russia for global influence, the administration has voluntarily dismantled one of its most effective tools for international engagement. Chinese and Russian cultural institutions are already moving to fill the vacuum, offering partnerships and exchanges to institutions that can no longer work with American counterparts. The economic implications ripple far beyond Washington, D.C. The Kennedy Center employs approximately 3,000 people directly and supports thousands more jobs in surrounding businesses. These workers, many of them immigrants and people of color, received no advance warning and no severance packages. They simply arrived at work to find the building closed and their livelihoods eliminated. The broader arts ecosystem that depends on Kennedy Center programming faces similar devastation. Smaller venues, community arts organizations, and educational institutions that partnered with the center have lost their primary source of support and collaboration. Regional orchestras that relied on Kennedy Center touring circuits can no longer access those opportunities. Music students who competed for Kennedy Center fellowships have lost pathways to professional development that cannot be easily replaced. The constitutional questions raised by this closure reveal deeper issues about the relationship between federal power and cultural expression. The Kennedy Center operates as a federal institution, established by Congress and partially funded through annual appropriations. Trump's unilateral decision to close the facility and rename it represents an assertion of executive authority over cultural policy that exceeds traditional presidential powers. Congress authorized and funded the Kennedy Center as a memorial to President Kennedy and a showcase for American artistic achievement. Trump's transformation of the institution into a personal monument violates both the spirit and arguably the letter of the legislation that created it. Democratic lawmakers have filed suit challenging the renaming and closure, but legal proceedings move slowly while cultural damage accumulates rapidly. The precedent being established extends far beyond the Kennedy Center to encompass the entire federal cultural apparatus. The Smithsonian Institution, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Library of Congress, and other federally supported cultural institutions now face potential similar treatment. If the president can unilaterally close and rename major cultural facilities, no federal arts programming remains secure from political manipulation. State and local governments are scrambling to fill the void left by federal withdrawal from cultural leadership. California, New York, and Illinois have announced emergency funding for arts organizations affected by federal cuts. European foundations have established programs to support American artists who can no longer access federal resources. These efforts cannot replace the scale and prestige of federal cultural investment. The international cultural community has responded with strategic calculation. European concert halls and museums are actively recruiting American artists and administrators, offering visas and employment to cultural professionals fleeing political persecution at home. This brain drain represents a massive transfer of cultural capital from America to Europe, weakening American cultural institutions while strengthening potential competitors. Chinese cultural institutions have moved particularly aggressively to exploit American cultural self-destruction. The Beijing Philharmonic has announced a new international tour program explicitly marketed as an alternative to American cultural leadership. Chinese museums are expanding their international exhibition programs, offering partnerships to institutions that can no longer collaborate with American counterparts. These initiatives position China as the defender of international cultural exchange, while America retreats into nationalist isolation. The long-term implications for American cultural production remain deeply concerning. Young artists, seeing the political weaponization of major cultural institutions, increasingly view careers in the arts as politically dangerous. Applications to conservatories and art schools have declined sharply. International students who have historically chosen American arts programs over European alternatives are reconsidering those decisions. The Kennedy Center closure also eliminates crucial platforms for emerging artists. The Center's annual Emerging Artists program has launched careers of musicians, dancers, and actors who went on to international prominence. The NSO Summer Music Institute has trained thousands of young orchestral musicians. These pipeline programs, developed over decades, cannot be quickly reconstituted once destroyed. Corporate sponsors have begun withdrawing support from federal cultural institutions, recognizing that association with Trump's cultural agenda carries reputational risks in international markets. Major foundations are redirecting resources toward independent cultural organizations rather than federal institutions. This private sector response accelerates the collapse of federal cultural leadership while strengthening alternative institutions. The Kennedy Center's closure represents a test case for whether democratic institutions can resist authoritarian capture. Cultural institutions, because they depend on government funding while maintaining artistic independence, face particular vulnerability to political interference. The center's transformation into a Trump monument demonstrates how quickly authoritarian leaders can weaponize cultural policy to silence opposition and reshape national identity. International allies watch this cultural destruction with alarm, recognizing that America's retreat from cultural leadership creates opportunities for authoritarian regimes to expand their influence. Cultural diplomacy represents crucial terrain in competition between democratic and authoritarian systems. When America abandons cultural engagement, it cedes intellectual and moral leadership to competitors. The Kennedy Center's closure occurs against the backdrop of similar attacks on cultural institutions globally. Authoritarian governments from Hungary to Brazil have targeted arts organizations, recognizing that cultural institutions often serve as centers of democratic resistance. Trump's cultural policies align America with this international authoritarian playbook, abandoning its historical role as a defender of artistic freedom. As the Kennedy Center sits empty, its concert halls dark, and its educational programs terminated, we are witnessing more than the closure of a cultural facility. We are observing the systematic dismantling of the soft power infrastructure that has projected American values globally for generations. The building may reopen after its 2-year renovation, but the institution it housed may not survive this assault. The artists and audiences who gathered at the Kennedy Center represented America at its most aspirational. Diverse communities coming together to experience beauty, challenge, and transcendence. The destruction of this gathering place represents not just cultural loss, but the deliberate impoverishment of American democracy itself. The quiet violence of closing America's cultural heart through a social media post reveals the contempt with which this administration views artistic expression and the communities it serves. The Kennedy Center's closure forces a fundamental question about American identity. Will the United States remain a nation that nurtures artistic expression? Or will it retreat into nationalist isolation that sacrifices cultural leadership for political control? The answer will determine not just the future of American arts, but America's role in the global community of democratic nations. This moment reveals the true cost of cultural warfare, not just the silencing of artists, but the abandonment of America's moral authority in the world.